and welcome to Keep the Bastards Honest, the podcast of the Australian Democrats. I'm your host, Elana Mitchell, and on this episode, we take a look at the 2024 federal budget. Rejoice, budget nerds, it's that time of year again. This time, our regular budget correspondent for the youth, Rhiannon Curnow, was unable to join us due to life getting in the way. And Victorian State President Leonie made the mistake of admitting to me that she's a bit of a budget nerd. So I recruited her to come along and have a chat about all things budget, which simply proves the maxim that no good deed goes unpunished. Leonie and I are joined, as always, by my ever-thoughtful co-host, Steve Beatty. Just a couple of notes before we begin. I had a couple of technical hiccups as we got set up for recording, so my audio isn't quite as clear or sharp as I would like, but I'm still mostly audible. And for a budget that I initially described as a bit meh, it did spark some passionate discussions and debate, and consequently this episode is really long, and I apologise for that. I did try to trim it down to a consumable length, and I do hope you enjoy it. Leonie, Steve and I pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we recorded this episode, and their elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded. So good to see you both, and thank you so much for coming on to talk all things budget with me. Now, before we get into the details of everything, I feel like we need to sort of rip the Band-Aid off and answer, I think, the most pressing question, which is, was this an election budget?
It was a tiptoe into an election budget. It was a safe bet, I think, not wanting to piss anyone off, but not trying to create any big waves.
Steve?
It was an election budget, well and truly. I think the thing that stood out for me most was really continuing to avoid any major structural changes to our economy, with one exception, and that notable exception being the Stage 3 tax cuts, which we've pretended by and large hasn't happened. It is a massive change to our income tax system, like our personal income tax system. It's a big expenditure item at $20 billion a year to start with. It was inherited from the previous government, so you can pretend that it was not really ours, but they did make changes to it and kind of need to own it. And it's sitting there, right? Like it's the one sitting there. But at the same time, it's only one of many sort of structural issues in the economy. So the funding structure of the age pension, the funding structure of the NDIS, the overall structure of our tax system, the tax concessions that go towards private property investors, the tax concessions that go to superannuation contributions, like all of those things are growing and becoming bigger impositions on our budget. None of them were touched. So, I mean, that's a clear sign to me that despite what they have done, and they've done a lot, that they've avoided, really, to Leonie's point, annoying anyone too greatly. It's not quite the big spending splash that you can see in the immediate lead up to an election. So that part will be interesting as we get towards March and April next year. Do they do an early budget like the Morrison government did in 2022? Do they hold off until they retain government and say, look, here are our ideas, and as soon as you vote us back in again, we'll put it into a budget? I don't know. Time will tell.
I sort of fall in between both of you in that I felt a lot of hedges were being bet in that budget. It was, I think, primarily a please don't be annoyed with us for the cost of living kind of budget. And as Leonie was saying, like they've gone out of their way not to annoy anybody just in case it inadvertently becomes an election budget. I mean, Jim Chalmers is actually on record. I think it was an interview with Karen Middleton where he said point blank that the current plan is to go full term and hold an election in May. And therefore, he expects to have a fourth budget in the lead up to that election. That one, I think, will be the election budget. This is almost like a Clayton's election budget. It's sort of like the election budget you have, and just in case you end up having an early election because, events, dear boy, events, but not a proper full-blown, full-blooded election budget. And I think the consequence of that is that it was a bit of a nothing burger. It was a budget that was striving very, very hard to be inoffensive, and therefore wasn't, in my mind, super effective's probably the wrong word, but it was very, very steady. She goes, we've not annoyed anybody. We've not done any major structural changes to the economy or things. It was just, here's a budget because we're required to have a budget, and please, everyone, just forget about it.
Alana, given your reference to the nothing burger, can I use my meat pie analogy here?
Oh, please go for it.
I think you have to.
Yeah.
So I have a tradition of picking a budget meal each year, and I don't too overthink this, but I do have a bit of fun in coming up with what I'm going to eat on that night. And we had homemade meat pies on budget night, and I feel like I think I did well with my choice of meal that night.
And do you predict the nature of the budget based on your meal?
Yeah, totally. I totally do. So, I've had some years where I've had a really good red wine. I've had some where I've had a very budget red wine. I've had some where I've had a really budget cut of meat. I've had some when we've had leftovers. But the meat pie for me made sense, right? I think there's a lot in this budget that requires some unpacking, and there's a lot that goes into a meat pie, and sometimes you don't really want to know what goes into it, but there's a lot to unpack. But it's a fairly inoffensive kind of stock standard, here's your thing. And you kind of know most of what's in it already, in fact, which we did, which is why I was able to predict the meat pie. But there's nothing particularly exciting about it. There's nothing that right immediately, at least, kind of feeds the good and structurally creates an amazing kind of vision for who we are and where we are. It's just pretty El Blando. And I think that's the bit that feels like, if I go back to your first question, it feels like it was the safe bet. It was let's not actually cause any waves. Let's just kind of serve something up that's just kind of edging towards something. But I'm not really sure what that something is. And the bit that I always listen for on budget night is, what's your narrative? What's your vision for where we're going, who we are as a nation? Like, I want that to be the headline. And I didn't get that from this budget. I think Jim Chalmers is an excellent speaker. I think he speaks beautifully. I think he speaks very clearly, and you can sit there and listen to everything that he says and go, yep, that sounds great. But I still don't come away with a sense of excitement of who we are and where we're going. I still don't come away with a sense that there is a really clear, exciting vision for who we are as a country. And that's the bit that's the missed opportunity, I think, in any budget, if we don't get that sense. And instead, it played immediately into the stupid politics 2 nights later of fear, right? It just opened the door for that then to be the headline story for the rest of the week, which I'm still recovering from.
It's unfortunate because, and by that I mean it's unfortunate that narrative is missing, because there certainly do seem to be elements of the budget, and particularly some of those sort of major initiatives and programs, where you would look at that and say, that seems to be based on a vision for what this country can and should be, but subsequently not articulated in a coherent or cohesive way. And an example, I guess, is the way in which the Future Made in Australia program was spoken about. So it's a large initiative. It's $20-odd billion in funding across various forms. The idea is that Australia once more has a strong sovereign manufacturing capability, that it's able to make more of the sorts of things that we use in this country, that we develop our advanced manufacturing capabilities. So building high-tech or high-quality or highly engineered types of things. Solar panels, one of the examples that were rolled out, but all sorts of things, from energy inverters and switches and solar panels and wind turbines and you name it, all of which fall under the umbrella of renewable energy. We want to be able to make more of those things in Australia. We've got the raw materials to do it. And at the moment, what we do is we dig stuff out of the ground, we send it overseas to be processed. The processed materials get sent somewhere else to be manufactured into stuff. We import it back into the country and we make use of it. And we lose most of the value that thing generates, even though it might be embedding our intellectual property, it may be embedding our research and development efforts, but we're not the ones making the sort of the commercial benefit out of it. Instead, we're giving that benefit to overseas entities, countries even, So that whole idea of saying, well, look, let's start investing in building up that capability in Australia. Let's start leveraging Australia's design capability, our research and development capability, our innovation capability, which are world renowned. Let's build up our capability to process the materials that we dig up out of the ground using our renewable energy capability. Let's develop that so that we can do those things in much more energy effective ways and low carbon ways. Let's turn them into things that we can export around the world because they're of high quality and valuable and in high demand. And let's sort of keep that value back in Australian hands. That's wonderful, right? And you can see how that feeds into our research and development efforts in our universities and in the institutes and the organisations that are associated with them. You can see how it feeds through into TAFE and vocational education. You can see how it flows through into apprenticeships and internships and traineeships, like right across the board, all the way through into getting more wealth and more value and more protections back in the hands of traditional landowners and the traditional custodians of our land. Like all of that kind of stuff you look at and go, beautiful. If you want to spend $20 billion building that kind of stuff, all for it. And instead we get this sort of list of investments as this sort of eclectic list with numbers attached to them and none of that overarching narrative. And it's such a waste.
And it is. And because they provide this eclectic list, then everybody nitpicks at that list and goes, why are you picking winners?
What are we doing here?
What the fuck is quantum computing?
I don't see how those things connect. What are you doing?
Yeah. And look, I work in IT, so I'm all for quantum computing. That is definitely the next big,
Yay!
How that's going to actually help Australia become the country we want it to be. If the government can't answer that question, who's supposed to be answering it?
But I think Steve kind of did though, right? This is the bit. It's able to be narrated.
Right there.
Not to denigrate Steve. It's not hard. You didn't script that. That was off the top of your head. You did a really, really good job.
I don't have a speech writing staff either. Jim does.
Exactly.
Might need to be on that speech writing staff.
I've said this off podcast a number of times, Steve for PM. It's no brainer.
Stones to step through between here and that one.
Well, this is true,
Elena, but I appreciate, and I have appreciated your confidence in the past. Thank you.
Just plug that further. I think the bit, Steve, that you get and that you do really well, right, is that you, and this is the bit that I feel was missing on the night, you can do the detail and you can do the big picture. You can jump into the detail and the data, which is absolutely vital when we're talking about a budget, but you can actually provide the narrative and say, this is why this matters. This is where we're going and this is why and this is how exciting it is. And this is the missed opportunity at the moment, which again is like you did that in a couple of minutes. That's the bit that just we missed out on Tuesday night.
That's the bit that tells me that it's not an election budget. Because if it was and it lacked that narrative, they're sunk, right? They've just started their election campaign completely at sea, if that's what it was meant to do. It's just not there. And look, the future made in Australia is only part of it. Because another part of it you sort of look at and go, well, we're investing billions of dollars in new housing. We want to build 1.2 million homes between now and 2030, 200,000 homes a year. We're going to, okay, why? Because secure housing is one of the most fundamental rights that we think every Australian should have. Okay, well, that's a beautiful election platform to run on. Again, it sits down here in the fields and it's something that people can take viscerally and go, yeah, it's absolutely something I can get behind. Even if I disagree with you on some of the rest of it, I can at least agree with you and have some common ground that says everyone deserves somewhere to live.
You're absolutely spot on, right? We didn't get any of the feels, and I like that. It didn't hit us. It didn't hit us with I'm totally with that. It had the opportunity to in a number of different areas. It absolutely had the opportunity to, but it didn't deliver on that. I'm going to fall prey to what I have been criticising journalists for all week, but I'm going to do it anyway. I have rarely, if ever, given a poo about the budget reply. This budget reply has had more airplay than any budget reply I think ever. And on one blooming thing, like it just is astounding to me that has got airplay, but it got airplay because there was a vacuum. There was a vacuum for what the budget on Tuesday night was really ultimately about.
Hi guys, Editing Elana here. just in case you actually did miss the budget reply, because we didn't, and we're talking like we know what we're talking about, Peter Dutton promised to slash immigration in order to then therefore somehow make housing more affordable, which has been roundly excoriated by people who actually know what they're talking about, because it's racist dog whistling turned up to 11 and also won't fix whatever it is that he thinks he's trying to fix, and won't actually solve the housing crisis on any level. So just in case you're wondering what on earth we were talking about in regard to the budget replies, since Leonie was so desperate not to give it any more airtime than it's already gotten, that's what's going on. Back to the podcast.
Cost of living was kind of the one throwaway line, really. I didn't really get a sense of anything other than we're trying to do our best with cost of living. And that doesn't give me enough of a, yep, you got me, because it just doesn't, clearly, right? It's not enough, and it just opened the doorway for everybody to say it's a not enough budget, right? You've not done enough on every possible measure, which probably says that yes, absolutely, they've balanced everything as best they could, because no one's happy with it in that sense. But it absolutely opened the door for a political slam dunk, if you like, by an incompetent budget reply on any measure, I think. And yet that is what has become the news. I'm falling prey to it by mentioning it, but I feel like we can't not mention it, because that became then what the story was.
Yeah. And look, part of the story, to credit some areas of the press gallery, part of the story has been dedicated to debunking the bollocks in that budget reply and debunking the outright lies and misinformation and the racist dog whistling that Dutton was indulging in. But not enough.
It depends on which echo chamber you're in, though, Elana. It depends on what algorithm is feeding you what, right? Or what news you tune into. Because, yes, there have been journalists that are trying to debunk it, but it's still the news item across the board.
Oh God, yeah. I'm not just reading that for a moment, but what I found interesting was that a year ago, nobody would have tried debunking it. It just would have been reported as a he said thing. This is the budget, this is the reply. But now, that admittedly it's still a small cohort, but there is now a cohort of journalists who are looking at what Dutton is saying much more critically and calling out the lies. And that was not happening a year ago or 18 months ago. Not as critically, I should say. But you now have mainstream journalists actively calling it out.
Does that not also play into his strategy, though, right? Because I kind of feel like this, and this is why I called out, I feel like I'm now also falling into the trap by mentioning it, but I feel like that's his strategy. He doesn't care that people are trying to pull apart his figures, because he knows the fact that that's controlling the airwaves, he's getting far more airplay than Chalmers is. So it plays into his strategy, whether they criticise him or not.
It's 100% out of the Donald Trump, Steve Bannon flood the zone with feces strategy.
100%.
Right? Because his strategy is to get that soundbite out. And this is where the misinformation, the lies, and off the right, the far right, I should say, like the insane right, has it over the more rational, evidence-based part of the population.
But we're not learning from it, though.
Yeah,
we've not learned from what's happened, because, and this, I guess, is my point, that even if journalists are trying to debunk it, they are still giving it far more airtime than it was worth. And why? Because, again, that plays into, he becomes the populist figure that is talking about stuff that people want to talk about but don't, because they feel like they can't.
Yeah. But the thing is that I don't think anyone's actually worked out how to contest it properly yet.
Don't interview him would be the thing to do, and simply provide the truth. So I think it's George Lakoff who has written some wonderful books about framing in particular, and the way in which the framing of a challenge or a problem or an issue impacts the way in which we respond to it. But he has this thing which he calls the truth sandwich. If you want to counter a lie, don't repeat the lie, sort of highlight the truth, then talk about the lie, and then repeat the truth. You don't lead with the lie, because that's the bit people will remember. So you could talk to Dutton, you could play a sound bite, and the same goes for all of them, right? Because it's not just him, it was just him this week. But the thing to do would be to say immigration into Australia has little to no effect on the price of housing or the availability of housing stock. Here's what the opposition leader had to say this week in his budget reply. and then finish with, but that's not true.
Yeah, this is why he's wrong.
Lakoff came out with that kind of structure in response to Trump's first presidential campaign nearly 10 years ago. So it's not like it's new information or a new strategy. It's sort of a well-established one that we're just not taking advantage of. Anyway, there are lots of good things to talk about in the budget or from the budget. There were lots of lackluster things. I think it might be worth starting with the good things. Elana, if you want to start with the good things, we can start with the good things that were in the budget.
Because I have a couple of rants lined up for some of the stuff that I was really annoyed about. So I'll let you start with the positive stuff first.
Sure. I guess for me, one of the standouts, and this is sort of me thinking about what are the major challenges that we're facing as a society, what are the things that we really need to lean into solving and that kind of stuff. And the climate crisis is certainly one, and the state of the Australian economy and our ability to compete and our ability to be a developed economy is sort of one or the other. So the Future Made in Australia program, it's really interesting for me to see that kind of investment attempting to address what has variously been described as the missing middle of the Australian economy. And it refers both to the bit in the economy where we actually make things. We're good at digging stuff out of the ground and we're good at deploying technology. Australia is one of the best countries in the world for our use of technology. But I saw something from IP Australia a few weeks back that indicated that Australia only makes use of something like 10% of homegrown IP. So when we put things installed into a home or installed into a business or whatever it may be, when you look at that across the economy, only 10% of that stuff is Australian developed. In a country like America, it's closer to 80 or 90%, where the things that they're making use of embody their own know-how and intellectual property. Other developed OECD countries are closer to sort of 50, 60%, the likes of Germany, Singapore, those sorts of countries. Half of it was developed locally, half of it's imported from overseas. Australia, well and truly, despite the fact that we have quite a robust R&D program, we don't make good enough use of it. And that's sort of part of the missing middle. The other part of the missing middle is that the shape of the Australian economy is a lot of really small businesses. So 1 to 5 employees, 1 to 10 employees, and there are about 2 million businesses of that sort of size and shape, all the way through to your large corporates and your medium-sized enterprises, your $50, $100 million a year turnover, employing a couple of hundred people, the sorts of businesses that can compete overseas but aren't multinationals, we just don't have them. We just don't have that mid-piece of the Australian economy. And they're, again, like it's a sign of a lack of complexity, a lack of richness, a lack of diversification in the way in which Australia's economy operates. So Future Made in Australia and the National Reconstruction Fund and the Industry Growth Program and various others target that middle part of the Australian economy, and it's great to see. In doing so, there are sort of two key things subsequently that those policy decisions and that funding targets. And the key one really is that we're trying to drive the take up of renewable energy. So directing some of those funds towards renewable energy type programs and technologies, things like switching technology and inverters and wires and firming capability and batteries and this kind of thing, so that we develop them and make them locally. That's all good. And on the other side is the transition of the Australian economy to a circular economy, which the state and federal government has agreed we're going to target 2030 as the year by which we move from a traditional linear economy, dig stuff out of the ground, make something with it, use it, dispose of it, to a circular economy where materials and goods stay in circulation for much longer periods of time, where you've got much higher levels of repair, longer durability of materials, a lot more resource recovery going on, and minimal disposal of waste, right? Those principles being embedded in some of the funding decisions for the National Reconstruction Fund and Future Made in Australia. So this big spending program, if it's well structured and well targeted, should help drive those two sort of broader national initiatives, being circularity and addressing climate change and bringing down our emissions. That's awesome. And again, like, it's a sign that even though it hasn't been well articulated, the thinking is there in at least parts of the federal government that those things need to work together, that they need to form part of a cohesive national strategy, and that the policy frameworks need to be in alignment. And then hopefully we see it filter down to the states and all the rest of it. But there's at least evidence there in the Future Made in Australia program that that kind of thinking is going on. So that was a good thing for me. And obviously, my work with the Australian Design Council, I'm really sort of looking for those signs that those policy frameworks are being well designed.
And we say this often, and not we as the three of us, but we as a country say this often, that we really punch above our weight in so many areas. I mean, we invented Wi-Fi, we invented solar cells, we invented cochlear ear. So many things came out of Australia that have revolutionised the world. And we kind of almost just gave them away because we didn't have the confidence in ourselves to keep them here and develop them here and commercialise them here. I mean, I think I've mentioned on a previous podcast how the current generation solar cells were invented at the University of New South Wales, which is my alma mater. And that student took it home to China because he could not get the commercial backing here in Australia to develop it properly. Now he's a billionaire in China, and we import Chinese-made solar cells.
Yeah.
And what a story that would have been, right, to tell in perhaps not to that detail, but to tell the story as to why the Future Made in Australia program is so important in actually that not happening time and time again. So we can celebrate how amazing we are. We can celebrate what we are able to invent and come up with and develop, but we've got to close that gap to actually then make good on the investment that we've made from an R&D perspective to then actually have the returns. But yeah, that's because it's listening to both of you in that, right? I go, well, there's the story. Like, that would have had me sitting up on Tuesday night and going, yes, this is exciting. This is what we can do.
Put the pie away and break out the wine.
Yes, exactly. Right? I would have. There was no wine drunk on Tuesday night. Wasn't called for. But yes, spot on.
It's a really good example of the opportunities that we've missed in the past and if you wanted to get partisan about it, under previous governments, and why this government is different, why this government has a vision for the country and a place that they want to take us and something to strive for. Because now, Leonie, you're stepping in for Rhiannon because life has gotten in the way and she couldn't come along to represent the youth on the podcast. But that story would have told the young people in this country, this is why we need you to go to university. This is why we need you to go to TAFE and develop your skills. And this is going to give you something to work toward.
It could have been tied to that. The university placement, there's threads that they could have actually tied together beautifully on that.
They could have woven a tapestry with this. And it's not because Jim Chalmers is a bad storyteller. As you said, he's an excellent communicator. He's possibly one of the best that Labor have. And the fact that he cannot convey a compelling vision, it's really worrying to me, particularly a year out from an election.
They will need to get better at it. Otherwise, they're going to run over the next 12 months and constantly fighting somebody else's narrative rather than just being able to focus on their own. I just wanted to pick up on that question around younger people and university opportunities and trade opportunities and that kind of thing. The other thing that Future Made in Australia program provides for them, and look, there were things in the budget around education and university places and trade places and funding. There was obviously the cut in the indexation of HECS loans and help loans so that student debt, I think $3 billion worth of student debt was being to either wipe away or avoided in the future. That's that's a really good thing. But if the government is investing in smart ideas to develop them locally, those are opportunities for a university student with an idea to approach the government and commercialize it, right? Like, that's not you going and working in some large corporation for a job. This is an opportunity where the government will help you be an entrepreneur, be an inventor, be an innovator, and build something here in a way that we haven't really incentivized for 20, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years maybe. And finally, we've got a government that is, in fact, willing to invest in those things. And I think that's great. I really do. I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge. And I think my key frustration broadly with the budget is that they've not managed to properly solve anything. They've spread a lot of love across a number of different issues, and they've made progress on a number of different issues, but they've not actually managed to just completely solve anything. So the HEC stuff, brilliant, long overdue. They should never have allowed that 7% inflation-based increase to go through last year. I'm glad that they wiped it out and that they're looking at reforming the way HECS is managed going forward. That's excellent. The problem is degrees are still going to cost $50,000. They've not actually done anything to address the
actual cost of education.
Exactly. And the terrible changes that Morrison put in. And on top of that, free TAFE, brilliant. But a friend of mine on Twitter is studying to be a chef. So she's going to TAFE. She's getting her TAFE course for free, which is awesome because she's a single mother. But she said the cost of the course is actually probably the least of her problems. She has to buy equipment. So she has to buy knives and all the stuff that you need to be a chef.
And they're expensive.
She has to buy a uniform. She has to travel to TAFE. So there's the cost of transport. There's all the supplies and things that go into actually being a student that she's still on the hook for. And her child turned 16 last week. So again, we've talked about this last year with the changes to the parenting payment, where now the additional parenting payment stuff cuts out when they turn 16. Because apparently between 16 and 18, they suddenly don't.
Yeah, kids become free, apparently.
Yeah. So they'd be paying people to do their placements. Again, brilliant, because people literally were not finishing their education because they couldn't afford to work for free for 6 months in their placements, except they're only giving them $320 a week, which in the middle of a cost of living crisis. The minimum wage is I think just over $800 a week. And that's the minimum wage. That is the barely above poverty line wage.
There's no excuse in my mind. Sorry to interrupt, but
No,
there's no excuse in my mind for those payments to be below minimum wage.
It's $8 an hour.
There's none. So minimum wage should be essentially what anyone gets for showing up and doing any job, by definition, trained or otherwise. So on your first day in a low-skilled job, that's what you can get. If that's $800 a week and you're doing a paid place, like a placement for your university course or your TAFE course to earn your qualification, I guarantee you that workplace is making good use of your time. You should be compensated at least at that level. It feels like a no-brainer, but we're exploiting a group of people instead. Leonie?
So I don't disagree with that. It seems fair, fine. But we can't do more than what, when I say we, the government, who has come up with this budget, cannot do more than a kind of sprinkling of here's some support, here's some support, here's some support in different areas. They can't do any more than that without significant other change to the system, right? Because it all has to be funded in some way. And so I feel like this budget has been kind of like you get a little bit, you get a little bit, you get a little bit. And to Elana's point, it doesn't solve any one issue in its entirety, albeit I kind of query whether that's possible anyway, but we can try. But we don't get to do that unless we look more holistically at things and unless we're actually brave in how we try and solve for things. And I don't feel like this is the brave budget in any way, shape or form. It's here's a sprinkling to try and kind of hold things together as best we can to still be able to say, look how good we are at managing the economy, because they're desperate to say that. And so they're just kind of, it's a sprinkling budget rather than here's something that addresses an absolute underlying unfairness in the system.
I think your criticism there is spot on in that this is not a brave budget. This is not a budget designed to be brave. This is a government that did not want to be brave in this budget. This is a government that wanted to fly under the radar and not be noticed. which seems to be becoming a real pattern with the government. And everyone talked about the 2022 election where they presented a small target and they sort of snuck into
Sure.
government and all this sort of
Sure.
stuff. And I'm actually now
Yep.
starting to wonder, based off this conversation, was that strategic genius, or is it simply that they're just not that brave? And that's just who they are, and that's just how they operate.
But maybe
And
that's what we're getting because that's what we voted for, though, right? And that's what we're putting up with, or what we will put up with as a population. Like we get the government we deserve, right? Don't we? Is that not the way it works? We're not wanting them to be brave. I mean, personally, we can say clearly we want them to be braver. We want them to step into spaces and actually solve bigger problems. But ultimately, the voter doesn't seem to want that, or doesn't get why that would be a really good thing. And so everyone then kind of steps back and plays scared.
But I do feel, though, it is up to the government to lead that conversation and bring the country with them. I mean, was it 2, maybe 3 weeks ago, thousands of people across this country marched in protest at the horrendous violence against women that permeates society. And Albanese came out and went, this is a whole of society solution that is required. The government can't do everything. And look, he is technically correct, which Futurama tells us is the best form of correct. However, who's going to lead that conversation? Who is going to marshal society to stand up and say, yes, let's work together and solve this? It's the freaking government. It's literally what we vote them in to do, right? They are our representatives. Like this is government as a whole. This is not just, I'm not being partisan here. But you are correct, Leonie, in yes, we might get the government that we deserve and all this sort of stuff. But it feels a little bit victim blamey in some ways, because I certainly didn't vote for a gun-shy, cowardly government who just wanted to maintain the status quo. I definitely voted to get rid of Scott Morrison because I felt like he was destroying the country. But I voted for something that was fundamentally different to Scott Morrison. I don't feel that we're getting it.
I think that's unfair. I think we have something that is significantly different to what the previous government was, because that was devoid of any vision, devoid of any decision making. I think they have gone way ahead on where they were at. It's just that the bar was ridiculously low. I totally agree. They're not giving us what we want and what we were hoping they would deliver on, which was something more than they were promising actually than at the election. To say that they haven't actually moved some way from where it was at would be, I think that's unfair, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is Chalmers' third budget, right?
Yeah.
He's had 3 opportunities now to make fundamental changes to what the coalition either destroyed or put into place. And I don't feel that he's gone very far. There's so much of our political infrastructure is still maintaining coalition era initiatives, and they're tinkering around the edges. So, they're wiping out a little bit of HECSTEP. They've not rolled back the incredibly expensive degrees that Morrison has foisted on anybody who wants to study humanities. They make courses free, but the cost of actually studying is still sky high, and support to study is still practically non-existent. Youth allowance and Oz study payments are actually lower than the dole, and the dole is ridiculously like it's Mariana Trench levels below the poverty line. This is where I get incredibly frustrated. Like, again, 3 weeks ago, Albanese is coming out and going, violence against women. And I should say male violence. It's not violence against women, because women aren't the only gender who are being impacted by this. But male violence in this country is a scourge. And he came out 3 weeks ago and totally agreed with that. And yet there's all in the budget to actually address it. They're spending about $900 million making a Morrison-era initiative permanent. But it's a Morrison-era initiative where only 15% of the women who applied for the $5,000 payment to escape violence actually got it. And that $5,000 payment isn't actually a payment. It's a $1,500 cash payment. And then you get $3,500 of services and goods. Again, in the middle of a cost of living crisis. Even if it was a $5,000 cash payment, that wouldn't even cover bond on a new place to live, much less put food on the table for your kids, much less give you any kind of security. And so if they really wanted to address male violence, they would address female poverty. and they would enable women and children to be able to escape poverty and to escape the violence that they're living in. Paul Carr from The Guardian asked a brilliant question of Jim Chalmers, which he dodged. And then Karen Milton, who's The Guardian's new political editor, picked that up in an interview that she did with Chalmers and asked him the same question again. And he gave a very, very nothing answer.
We've been asked about JobSeeker a few times, and you gave your National Press Club address. And in fact, my colleague Paul Carp asked you a question about JobSeeker, and his question really, I'm not sure that he got an answer, so I'm going to have another crack. But he was making the point that when are the economic circumstances going to be right to have another rise in JobSeeker? Because your own anti-poverty advisory committee, led by Jenny Macklin, has recommended it. Stephen Kennedy's on that committee. Yeah. You know, they said it's absolutely essential, urgent, and you've said we can't do everything all at once. But what economic conditions would provide the opportunity to do that, given how important that committee has said it is?
Well, as much as I respect Paul's ongoing interest in this, one of the things that is sometimes missing is recognition that we have raised the rate in our time in office. And I know people would like more than $40 a fortnight, but that's not an insignificant part of the last budget that we handed down. And so it's partly about economic conditions, partly about fiscal constraints. It's also about working out the best way that we can help people. And I take that Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee very seriously. We have been working our way through a whole bunch of the recommendations. There's more than one recommendation in those EAC reports. I go to those meetings sometimes. I present to those meetings. I read very carefully every word of their reports. I've written in detail back to give a progress report on the things that we're implementing from that. But I mean it when I say it's not been possible for us to take the whole report and implement it immediately, and that's not because of an absence of goodwill or an absence of understanding. It's just trying to make everything add up, and there's lots and lots and lots that we're doing for people who are on low and fixed incomes and vulnerable people, including in the budget we handed down on Tuesday night.
At which point, because we apparently can't do it when the economy is booming.
What are we waiting for?
But we also can't do it in the middle of a cost of living crisis, because apparently massive inflation increases don't affect poor people. That's what I'm angry about. And that's where I feel like they're maintaining the Morrison status quo. So I completely accept your criticism that I'm being unfair, but I feel justified in being unfair.
But doesn't it kind of, again, go back to this challenge that we've got of they're not being courageous, right? And so they could solve more if they thought bigger and if they wanted to lean into some of the bigger structural opportunities they have from a tax perspective, but they have not. And I don't get any sense that they have any intention to at all. And so what we risk, I guess, is then we will continue to have a government post the next election, if they get back in again, that will continue to just tinker, because what's the incentive for them to do otherwise?
And we talked earlier about structural issues in the Australian economy. So we're going to spend $925 million, I think is the exact figure, or that and change, to fund, as you say, like a pilot program that Morrison government initiated a few years ago. So that's over the forward estimate. So $925 million over 4 years, I guess. Domestic violence costs the Australian economy $22 billion per year. That was measured in 2015-16. So it's absolutely a higher figure today. So we're spending $240 million a year to try and address a problem that's costing us over $20 billion annually, economically, let alone the personal cost, the mental, the emotional, and the physical cost to the individuals impacted by it. Now, if you want value for money, if you want a return on investment, fix that problem.
Yeah.
Don't spend $240 million a year. Spend $2 billion, spend $5 billion. You're still going to see a return on it if you actually take the problem seriously and do something about it. That I think, again, is that opportunity to be more ambitious in some of the thinking here. We saw it a few years ago, or like in the first budget with changes to aged care and aged care funding. It was better, but not what the reports indicated. We see it here with tinkering in the job seeker and student benefit payments where they've been lifted marginally, I think only been indexed anyway, rather than actually increased over and above that amount, despite the fact that the government's economic inclusion panel advised lifting it to 80% of the poverty rate. And that would have cost us about the same as the surplus that we're banking instead. So it's not like we can't afford these things. We're just choosing to do something different with the money instead. But again, like, it's a question of priorities. It's a question of, like, where do you want to spend your money? But that one for me, like, not more seriously addressing domestic violence and violence by men, whether it be in the form of education programs, communication programs, community-based programs to address the causes of toxic masculinity and violence, etc. But $240 million is nit. Like, that's peanuts in the face of a problem that is quite severe.
So there could have been another narrative, right, that would have absolutely hit the feels for so many people in this moment in time had they used a narrative of this is the cost to the economy if we do nothing, let alone the cost to the individuals that we see in our papers each and every day at the moment, right? So that would have hit the feels, but they missed that opportunity as well. And in fact, and I think this is the important bit when we talk about family violence as well, right, is that there were threads, again, beyond the here's this amount of money. There are other threads that all interconnect as well, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So the cost of living piece, they could have tied to what we are seeing from a family violence perspective, right? They could have woven a narrative that actually would have spoken to the moment, but they didn't. And then that also means that they're not able to be braver, I guess, in what they're trying to achieve in that space.
What we need to be careful of is that the only thing stopping this government from not being braver is them, right? This notion that the 2019 loss was not because Bill Shorten was brave.
No.
Bill Shorten, I think, again, it was the narrative thing. I think where Bill Shorten fell short was that he was not a compelling leader. And look, don't get me wrong, I think Bill Shorten would have been an excellent Prime Minister. I continue to mourn the fact that Morrison won the 2019 election and Bill Shorten didn't. I think we would be a different country if he had. However, Shorten didn't do the narrative thing. He had a laundry list of really good policies, but he didn't tie them together in this is the kind of country we can be. And again, left himself open to bollocks scare campaigns from Morrison. And they've taken, and again, we've spoken about this a number of times on the podcast, that they totally took the wrong lessons from that 2019 loss. And now they're too frightened to do literally anything. And everybody harkens back to, I don't think I was alive when Whitlam was Prime Minister. But everyone harkens back to the Whitlam era. And one way or another, people have very, very strong opinions about Whitlam, either for or against. But you can never have accused the man of not being brave. And there is social infrastructure in this country that exists to this day because Whitlam introduced it.
Of course. Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
And it feels like every subsequent Labor government, and even people look at the Hawke and Keating years and go, look at everything they've achieved. And there's a more critical view of that emerging with their introduction of neoliberalism into the country, but that's probably a topic for another podcast. But
different podcast.
Each successive Labor government has proven to be more and more timid, and their majorities have become smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's getting to the stage now where if you can't differentiate between the neoliberal hacks in the coalition and the Labor Party, it really does get to the point of going, well, at least the Liberal Party are quite open and transparent about their desire to hunt poor people for sport. And as has been said on Twitter, at least the Liberals will stab you in the chest. They won't stab you in the back the way Labor does. And there's going to come to a tipping point where people go, you know what, I think I'd rather just get my throat cut and be done with it rather than dare to hope and then get stabbed in the back. And I think the key to arresting that is to be brave. You know what? Don't be spooked by News Corp and the coalition, and don't be forever pandering to the demands of the coalition. Tony Abbott did it in opposition. Peter Dutton's now doing it in opposition, where they govern from opposition. Right? They dictate to the government what is acceptable, And whichever Labor Prime Minister is in power rolls over and bears their belly and goes, yes, Tony, or yes, Peter. I won't raise JobSeeker because News Corp and Coalition will lose their freaking minds over enabling poor people to actually pay their rent and eat.
In the same week.
In the same week, yeah, because that's the kind of country we are. The tipping point we're at is that we need the government to stand up and be brave and stare them down. And I think they will be rewarded, because I think the mood of the electorate in 2024 is really different from the mood of the electorate in 2019. If you stand up and lead, I think the people will follow you.
So that's the missed opportunity, though, right? That was what it could have been, this budget, but it was not. And I think going back to that point of the I know we've talked a lot about narrative, but the narrative is being controlled again by Dutton at the moment, not by the government. The government are failing fundamentally in having a really compelling story to tell about what they're doing and what's happening, and they just fumble with it. And it frustrates me because it shouldn't be that way. Even if they actually didn't do more than what they've currently done, right? They could still tell a better story than they're telling, and they're just not telling the story. Yeah. And we as human beings need stories to actually connect and understand what they're doing. And instead we get a shopping list of here's a dollar figure, here's a dollar figure, here's a dollar figure. But why?
Here's a shopping list of all the dollar figures that we've actually done to address poverty in this country. And people go, well, none of that registers. The hope, and I don't think it was a misplaced hope. It was a hope that the Labor Party deliberately fostered in people. It wasn't just a hope that let's try these guys because they have to be better than Morrison. I mean, I've seen a number of clips of Anthony Albanese making speeches that weren't that long ago, doing the narrative and the vision thing and going, this is not the kind of country we should be. This is the kind of country we should be. And now that he's Prime Minister, we're getting coalition talking points. And it's not even the hypocrisy that makes me incredibly mad. Again, as you said, Leonie, it's the lost opportunity. Prior to the 2022 election, the Labor Party were coming out and saying, it is a choice of this country to force people to live in crippling poverty, and that should change. Yeah. And apparently forcing people to live in crippling poverty was a crime when it was Morrison that was doing it. But they've had 3 opportunities now to lift JobSeeker and the disability support pension and youth allowance and AusStudy and AbStudy and all the other support payments to something livable. And we're still getting bullshit, nothing burger answers as to why we just can't afford it right now. We can give $11 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry, who are making criminal profits from war on top of that $11 billion subsidy that we give them. But we can't spend $5 billion raising JobSeeker to the poverty line. It's not even above the poverty line, to the poverty line. And this is a Labor government. This is the government that is supposed to be the government that does this kind of stuff for people, because the overarching narrative of this nation is that the coalition will hunt poor people for sport, and the Labor Party is supposed to come in and stop that. Except now it's the Labor Party hunting poor people for sport. I'm a little bit taken aback by how angry I am about this. This is tapped into something.
I don't know whether this helps or not. Might just play into the anger a little bit more. Part of the lack of courage that I see is the complexity that they are juggling, right? The complexity of trying to deal with an economy that is in a state that's quite weird and unusual in many ways, right? And they obviously have to be very, very cognizant of not triggering greater inflation than what we're dealing with. Like that is a vital piece in this. And so every decision that they have had to make in this budget, I suspect they have, under significant scrutiny, had that lens of, is this going to be inflationary, right? And so we could sit here and criticise any number of areas where they could have done more or could have done better, could have fixed other cost of living aspects, but most of them would have been very readily and easily criticised as inflationary. And even the ones that in some ways aren't, right? The $300 electricity, that's been criticised for all sorts of reasons. And to me, I kind of feel like it's one of the simplest, easiest things that they've actually done. I jump in and criticize me for this, but I kind of feel like it is a weird thing to criticize them for. Like they are doing it because it is easier to give it to the electricity companies rather than for them to try and create a system that enables them to check who is deserving and who is not of this money, they are sending it that way so that it's a reduction in those bills fundamentally, rather than here's some cash over here that could be spent anywhere and could potentially be inflationary, right? Like a kind of, to me, it seems like a really simple mathematical, this works as a stopgap measure here that surely we shouldn't be criticised for. And yet that's being criticised because it's going to everyone. It's going to Gina Reinhart. Like what, like really? Like, what? I don't know. So I get that criticism. I understand, of course. There's so many people that don't need it. But what they're actually trying to do is reduce the cost of those bills, which has an impact on what's happening from a cost of living perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to criticise it. This is rant number 2. I've had my job seeker rant. This is now rant number 2. So and I do understand the argument that means testing as itself is expensive, and I get all that. Except they did it last year. They means tested the exact same payment last year.
No, they didn't means test it. No, they gave it to those who were concession holders. They gave it to those who were concession holders, and the electricity companies have that detail. So it went through that way.
I have the budget paper here from last year. So people will be eligible for energy bill relief through this measure if they have a pensioner concession card, including those issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs, have a healthcare card, including low-income healthcare card, have a DVA Gold card, have a Commonwealth Seniors Health card, get family tax benefit Part A or B, or get carer allowance. That covers a rather large section of the population.
So I don't know how the mechanics of those last 3 works, to be fair, but all of the rest of them, the power companies have that detail because it comes off their bills. So it was a really easy mechanical, here's the money for those people only.
Yeah, and I get that, but the argument
so it's not
that
means tested as such.
But it kind of was. You know, like it's means tested, because the thing is, like, though to receive, to qualify for those payments is means tested, right? Right, because everyone goes, but it only went to concession card holders. Well, actually, it didn't, because if you get a family tax benefit A or B, that's not a concession card holding thingy. So it actually covers a much larger portion of the population than I had at first assumed. So I understand, and you did actually make a really good point that I'll come to in a minute later. I object to the argument that it was impossible to means test it this year when they literally did it last year. That counter argument annoys the living daylights out of me, as you guys can probably tell, because it's a nonsensical argument, right? Jim Chalmers, he was on the 7am podcast, and he came up with the most ludicrous counter argument to this criticism that I cannot believe this came from a man who I do think is an excellent communicator and a very good treasurer. But he said to the 7am host that, well, we're giving high-income owners a $4,500 tax cut, but everyone's whinging about us giving them another $300 in energy bill relief.
Does it nickel you a bit that, the top 20% who, like, essentially they have about 6 times more disposable income than the rest of us, that they're getting this, $300 bump?
Well, it's like I said before, we didn't design this policy to, with them in mind. We designed this policy with people on low and fixed incomes and middle incomes in mind, the people who are genuinely struggling. There's a lot of help that is provided broadly in the economy, and people have got views about that, and that's good. But also remember, and this goes to the kind of political argy-bargy about this very question that you're asking, when we said to the highest income earners, look, we don't think you should get a $9,000 tax cut, we think you should get a smaller tax cut, about half of that. We're talking there about 15 times this energy rebate. We're talking about $4,500. And so I think that sheds a bit of light on what's really happening in the political criticism about this. Some of our political opponents didn't think it was fair that we halved Gina Reinhart's tax cut. And now they're saying, it's outrageous that this is, which is 1/15 of the tax change that we made. And so I think we need a little bit of perspective. People know we are bona fides when it comes to helping people on middle incomes and low incomes. We showed that in the tax system. But in this instance, we're providing the support broadly for a reason, and there's also a logistical reason why it would have taken longer and cost more.
Dude, that is not the compelling counter-argument that you seem to think it is. Because we're giving them $4,500 in tax concessions, kind of...
What's another $300?
Yeah, like, we probably shouldn't be giving them an extra $300 in energy bill relief because they've got $4,500 in tax cuts, which apparently aren't inflationary. But the only compelling argument that I've heard about this, and you alluded to it, Leonie, actually came from the chief economist at the Australian Institute, Greg Jericho.
Yeah, I think this is actually quite a good policy. You can argue about whether it should have been means tested and perhaps the money used elsewhere. But the problem is if it was means tested or only limited to people who have got concession cards, the impact on inflation would not be as great.
Right.
And really what this policy is about is reducing overall inflation. So to do that, you kind of got to give it to everybody.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're only affecting the price of electricity of people on concessions, and that's not a majority of people in Australia, not a majority of households. It will lower the price of electricity a bit, but overall inflation wouldn't come down significantly. So that's kind of what they're doing here.
That energy bill relief, if it was targeted, would not hit enough households in order to bring down inflation. And that was the purpose of the payment, was to bring down inflation. They're not targeting it as a cost of living measure. Ultimately, its purpose is to reduce inflation. And that's where they're fucking up the narrative and the communication aspect of this. Because it's being framed as a handout to rich people, and they're allowing it to be framed as a handout to rich people. And what they should be doing is going, no. This is
designed to reduce it overall.
Yeah.
Why have they not said that? Like, because that to me is
Right?
yeah.
Because I was quite furious about it, because especially when I did the research and worked out that, well, actually it was targeted last year. So what is this nonsense about it being impossible to target it this year? They've actually literally managed it a year ago. I was quite angry about that. And again, I'm one of those, I'm not a high income earner, but I'm a higher income earner. I'm in probably the top 10% of income earners in this country. I don't need a $300 thingy off my power bill. My power bill's currently in credit because I pay it weekly. I'm fine. There are a number of people who earn considerably less than I do that desperately need it. So I was annoyed on that level. But when Greg Jericho said it's to reduce inflation, which would then benefit so many more people, particularly people who earn considerably less than I do, I was like, okay, no, I accept that. I'm no longer angry about the $300 energy supplement because it's working for the benefit of the country as a whole. I don't consider myself to be a comms expert on any level. And they, as you've pointed out, Steve, they've got speechwriters, they have literal comms experts, they have media liaisons, they have people who have left their media jobs and gone to work for them. How are they so bad at comms? Like, what?
My most interpretation is that they are laying policy traps for other parties to take positions that are subsequently open to attack that you and I haven't seen yet, that we haven't spotted them. That's my generous interpretation of what's happening with some of these things, that they are traps for others to walk into, potentially like the immigration thing, potentially get somewhere else. And we're just not really quite a clever rhetorical art.
I think that's being very generous.
Yes, I desperately hope
I can be some days. I really can be some days. It's the only way that I can sort of look at it and go, potentially I'm not seeing something that's there. It feels like something maybe that they're doing, that the way in which they're talking about some stuff is inviting attacks that they can subsequently do something with. Maybe. I don't really see it, but yeah, maybe I'm just...
Is it possible that they think that they will be rewarded for their competence and that they're relying on their sense of competence and sense of managing things better than previous governments have, and so therefore they are, and it goes back to this courage bit in part, right, that they are just focused on, like, I just need to work within these square walls, and if I do that, then I'll just keep being successful in what I'm doing.
The most likely avenue for them to be praised in this budget was the surplus, right? Like, they maintained a surplus for the second year in a row after 15 straight years of federal deficits, starting with the GFC and flowing. So Kevin Rudd's first 2 years in government, I think maybe his first budget was the last surplus. And subsequently, right through to 2022, we had deficits. Some of those for good reasons, some of those not so good, but like irrespective, you had 15 straight years of deficits. And then a surplus last year, and a surplus again this year. And as a government, you would expect that that would get you a degree of praise as good economic managers. Certainly the OECD has ranked Australia as the second best managed economy in the world for 2 years in a row now. And you would look at that and go, well, that's wonderful. The Australian Financial Review's post-election or post-budget analysis panned them for their spending splurge. So if they were expecting a pat on the back from the financial or economic media in response to the budget, they certainly didn't get it. It was described as a spending splurge, that Chalmers couldn't resist the temptation to spend. And when you actually look at it, the population increases, spending on things like health, education, defence, justice, social security payments, the National Disability Scheme, the age pension, etc., with a growing population, all of those things will increase. They haven't increased necessarily per capita, but we've got more people that need to be provided with those things. So you would expect the budget to go up, just like you would expect the tax take to go up if we've got tens of thousands of more people earning salaries, that salaries are increasing at 4% per year and corporate profits are up. Instead, though, it's being positioned as typical Labor tax and spend type budgets. That's not what it is at all. The only two surpluses we've had since the turn of the century almost, and they're getting panned for it.
Yeah.
What they were hoping for was a pat on the head.
Yeah. Coming back to your early points, I desperately hope that they're playing 4D chess. I'm not confident that they are. I think, as you both said, I think it's incredibly generous to assume that they're capable of playing 4D chess. And to your point, Leonie, I think you're right. I think this is the box that they've backed themselves into. They've delivered back-to-back surpluses, so the first one wasn't a fluke. And I think they've sacrificed a lot to be able to say that they've produced a second surplus. And I think women and low-income people are the ones that were tossed onto the altar. And I think you're right. I think you probably nailed their thinking, which is we need to be slow and steady, still presenting as a small target, and demonstrate to the Australian people that we are good economic managers and that we will be rewarded for our competence. And unfortunately, the times that we're living in call for a little bit more than competence. And my other criticism is that if that's the path that they're trying to go down, they're still doing a really, really terrible job of communicating that to people.
Yeah.
And of communicating
Absolutely.
their confidence to people. Because I do, the guys on the New Politics podcast raised this and said, we've had deficits pretty much since the turn of the century, as you put it, Steve. And the second that a Labor government produces back-to-back surpluses aren't important anymore. Surpluses are no longer a measure of economic competence. Now they're profligate spending, apparently. And it just goes to show that if Labor are looking for the media to pat them on the back and tell them how good they are going to be waiting decades of that.
Never going to happen.
And this is the other thing that frustrates me, is that this is nothing new. I mean, Labor have been dealing with negative media attention since the Second World War. The media in this country have never, ever been on their side. And so I can't believe that in this day and age that the Labor are still trying to be liked by people who it's embedded in their DNA that they will not. The media and particularly the boosters of the coalition in the media will literally tell you that the sky is green if it means that they can frame it in a way that it's Labor's fault. And Labor need to let go of that and govern. It's not like the media remain the gatekeepers of comms in this country. Labor now have the ability to go ahead and speak directly to the electorate. They have a number of channels on which to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So why they're still persisting in wanting the press gallery and the boosters in the media to pat them on the back and tell them how good they are is, again, another mystery to me. Don't spend all your time trying to allowing the media gatekeepers and the media narrative to dictate your actions. Act. Show the electorate that you are competent and improve living standards in this country. I mean, Greg Jericho was saying that our wages have gone back. Like, we've lost 14 years of wages growth, basically.
Yep.
So what our wages will buy now was the same as what we could buy back in 2010.
We're essentially 14 years behind where we were. Right now, people's wages can buy about the same amount of stuff than they could in 2010.
Wow.
Yeah. So, in a sense, your living standards, your ability to buy things is the same now as it was 14 years ago. Because what happened from 2010 to 2020, so an entire decade, wages went up about 5.5–6%, and we lost all of that improvement in 2 years. 2 years undid 10 years, but we don't regain that in 2 years. We're probably going to regain it in another 10 years. You know, it's
that slow.
It's a long, hard struggle. And even the budget figures suggest, we're going to have real wage growth for the next 5 years, which is excellent. We haven't had that since, 2020. But even if that comes true, the budget is estimating that by the middle of 2028, the amount of things that you'll be able to buy will be equivalent to the amount of things you were able to buy in 2014. So in a sense, still 14 years behind. Because think of it this way, if you lose the value of your real wage, to actually improve it, your real wages have to go up faster than they did in the past.
Yeah.
And that's really hard to do. And so it probably means if we keep going on the way we're going, we won't get back to being able to buy the amount of things that we were able to buy just before the pandemic until, about 2034.
So, I mean, you said it was all undone in those 2 years. That was because of the pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic and this spike in inflation. This spike in inflation that occurred, as we pointed out, because of profiteering, because of supply side shocks, had nothing to do with wages. Real wages weren't going up at all. Prices were going mad. And so that meant suddenly we were buying 4% less in 1 year than we could the year before because prices had gone up so much. The only way to reverse that is to have wages go up faster than inflation, but there's kind of a cap on that. There's always a limit to how much higher wages can be above inflation, whereas you can have a massive shock with prices, as we saw when you have a combination of coming out of the pandemic, you have Vladimir Putin deciding to invade Ukraine, which sends energy and oil and wheat prices all higher. The flow-on effect from companies going, we're going to take advantage of this and we'll raise prices more than we need to keep our profit margins nice and fat. All of that, when you put it all together, it means workers absolutely got smashed and it's going to take a long time to recover.
The way to be rewarded and to win over the people is actually make a material change to their circumstances. Don't just freaking talk about it or wait for the press gallery to pat you on the head and agree with you. Go ahead and do it. And it means being brave.
I feel like this whole piece, again, there's two things going through my mind. One is it is another example of where the opposition is controlling the narrative and has controlled the narrative from government and into opposition in terms of who the better economic managers are, right? And then the Labor Party have never created an alternative narrative to that that's stuck. Like they just have failed fundamentally in that. They've got so many stories that they could tell and stick to, and they just don't. There's a bit, again, there at narrative that I don't understand why they fail at it, but they fail at it over and over and over again. But then the other thing that's then going to my mind is we had Turnbull, right? And Turnbull was eaten alive by his own party that good at the one-line narratives, right? It's the one-line narrative in essence that kind of was his undoing in some ways too, right? Because Turnbull was able to lean into the complexity and lean into deeper conversations. And actually, I think he was pretty good at narrative. He sold me a number of times on what was possible, but he was continually stymied by that in terms of what story his own party was having him stick to or tell or abide by. And I feel like we're still stuck in that same nexus with this government. So it's a different party, but they are still stuck to reacting to these one-line narratives that hit the fear button for people rather than actually stepping into their own in saying, this is the alternative, this is what's possible, this is what we're going to do about it. I don't know what the solution is on that, but man, it's frustrating to watch. And I guess this then goes back to my comment about we get the government we deserve, and I don't like that line, but I kind of feel like we do, right? Because we have an amazing system. I would not want anybody else's system in the world. I want our system, but our system is clearly still imperfect, of course. Our challenge in our population is the disengagement. In fact, there's kind of a number of elements. We forget very quickly that once upon a time we had to do it all on our own and the government didn't provide anything to help us. We forget that so quickly, and that really frustrates me that we do have a mentality in Australia of what's the government going to do for me, and it grates me. I think we need to do more and better as a government in how we actually help people. But the mentality of what is the government going to do for me at every income level, I've got to say, at every income level, what's the government going to do for me, really frustrates me, as opposed to a government that's there to actually create and foster a better society, ideally. But the other bit, I think, is that while that's happening, there is also a disengagement from it's all same, right? Because we don't have an alternative vision for what we could be. We don't have a government that's saying this is what we're going to do. And so that is actively going to have us all disengage as well. How do we fix that?
If we knew the answer to that question, Steve would probably be Prime Minister now. Which is not to say that I'm not actively seeking it. But
I want a design element that we can point to. What's the design element that we can say this is the bit that will make all the difference?
But I think you're right, Leonie. A large part of the disengagement, I think, is driven by the fact that people are struggling to survive. A lot of people, they don't have the luxury of time and of interest to be able to be more politically engaged, which is, I think, partially by design, because the two major parties absolutely benefit from that political apathy and disengagement, and also the political ignorance. I think I said just after Labor were elected that I was confused by the fact that they continued to reach across the aisle to the coalition and wanted things to be bipartisan and wanted the coalition to support whatever it was that they were doing. Because if I was Albanese, I would drive the coalition before me and crush them beneath my boots and ensure that they would never, ever be able to recover sufficiently to be able to contest government again. And instead, from a political strategic perspective, they're busy fighting with the Greens over nonsense. And they close it up to the coalition to like instances where they could have absolutely chopped Dutton off at the knees and absolutely turned things on their heads for the coalition and made life really difficult for the coalition. They've chosen not to do that. And I think it's because they are far more focused on preserving the two-party system than they are actually about reforming the country. And this has got nothing to do with the budget, I have to confess, but it kind of feeds into the budget and it feeds into the framing of the budget, I think. They know the coalition, they're used to dealing with them, and they've not embraced the community independence. I understand why they won't embrace the Greens. The hatreds between Labor and the Greens run deep and fester and are never going to be resolved, and I accept that. But we get into this sort of situation where they'd much rather embrace a known enemy that they feel that they can work with than embrace new enemies like the community independence or even old enemies like the Greens to actually do something. Because, in terms of values and in terms of policy positions, community independence and the Greens are far more aligned with Labor than the coalition is. But they'd much rather embrace what the coalition has to offer in order to shut out the others. And I think it's going to cost them. I think the chances of them ending up in minority government next year are not zero.
I don't think that willingness to engage is one of policy. I think it's one of politics.
Yeah.
And it's not because they feel that they can reach common ground or have productive conversations. I think they prefer a world in which two major parties dictate things.
Yeah.
And working productively with the Teals or the Greens simply encourages a world in which we have more of them in Parliament. Now, for me, I think that's a great thing because from a policy point of view, I think it's a much more authentic working relationship. I think the sorts of things we've seen, and you can see evidence of it around the budget even. I've been really impressed in particular with Zoe Daniels and the way she's engaged with the budget process. I've been really impressed with the way David Pocock has engaged with the budget process.
Yeah.
They have been very firmly representing their constituents on questions of policy and positioning those questions of policy in the context of national interest and greater good. Zoe Daniels in particular talking about whistleblower protections, talking about domestic violence protections and programs, talking about homelessness and housing. David Pocock as well, like talking around these issues that they've shown consistently are of particular concern to their electorate. Pocock as a senator, Zoe Daniels as an MP, and I would love to see more of it. And I know it makes the negotiating process more messy. I appreciate that, but I love the idea of having these more nuanced, more policy-driven conversations. But it feels like the major parties try and avoid that as much as they can. But I've been very, very impressed with the way in which some of those independents in particular have fronted the budget process, putting forward quite good policy ideas, even subsequently, like even in the 3 days following the budget, coming out and going, look, this was good. We see areas for improvement over here. We would have liked to have seen funding for this or funding for that, which has been more productive than, say, the Greens' response, which was typically politically framed. And that's them. That's their flavour of political engagement. So, like, to be expected. But I find myself drawn much more to the way in which those teals have engaged. And as I say, like Zoe Daniels in particular has done a really, really remarkable job, I think, around that.
And David Pocock is absolutely the jewel of the crown of the Senate at the moment. He has been brilliant. And
yeah, he really has.
And I think his contribution has been outsized for his position as an ACT senator. And I think the country as a whole benefits from him being there. And so long may he contribute.
Yeah, I hope he sticks with it. I mean, we've got him for like another 3 years at least kind of thing, but I really do hope he sticks with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the two major thingies that I had a real beef with, I was particularly enraged by the framing of, we can't afford to do everything, therefore we can't afford to raise job seeker. That really, really annoyed me. If we can afford to give high-income people $4,500 in tax cuts, and we can afford to give the fossil fuel industry, which is literally cooking the planet, $11 billion a year in subsidies, maybe we could allow people to eat and pay rent in the same week. Just saying. And again, the lack of action on men's violence, to me, it was reflective of the way we diminish the role of women in society as a whole. But if you really wanted to materially address men's violence and allow women and children to escape men's violence, you ensure women can be financially independent and you give them secure housing. And those are the two areas that they fundamentally failed in this budget. And I get why they're failing on housing, because 2/3 of the country either own their home outright or they have a mortgage over it. And only 1/3 rents. And so in order to ensure that the 1/3 that rents can either rent secure, affordable, comfortable housing or go on to join the cohort that owns a house, you have to make housing affordable, which means that house prices has to fall, which means that the interests of the 2/3 of the population that either own outright or have a mortgage are not going to be served, and they're going to get annoyed. It's why no government of either stripe has done anything properly material to fix the housing crisis. And again, it's going to come back and bite them in the ass, big time.
Just on the housing issue quickly, we can address things like the capital gains discount, and we can address things like negative gearing, which I think contribute or cost the budget in foregone revenue something like $25 billion a year. It might actually be more like 35, but it's a lot of money. We can address those things in ways that don't cause housing prices to drop, but simply get them back to a situation. So if you look at the increase in housing prices prior to the introduction of the capital gains tax discount the 50% tax discount that was introduced, I think it was 1996, and the changes that came with that, with negative gearing and its application to property investments. House prices increased prior to that. From the 1940s through to the 1990s, house prices increased. They increased fairly reliably. They increased pretty much in line with wages. That was the difference. Once that capital gains tax was introduced, combined with negative gearing, it disassociated itself or disconnected itself from any kind of connection with wages growth.
Yeah.
And from that point onwards, property increased still, but it increased at double digits per year. So if we reintroduce those sorts of constraints that we had prior to 1996, which is not all that long ago, we would start to see a much more moderate and contained pace of house price growth, right? And you would expect to see it continue to rise, but continue to rise at a level that was more aligned with people's earning capacities. Now that leaves a gap, and the way you close that gap is through social housing.
Yes.
You close that gap through social housing. You undertake a massive program, and the government is committed to 1.2 million homes, and I think that needs to be just the start. But a national program that looks much more like the home building exercise that we undertook in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, rather than what we've got today, where only 2% of housing stock is social housing. It used to be much, much higher. We need to return to that. And that's how you close the gap between what somebody earns and their ability to afford a home based on median house prices type of thing. But it doesn't mean that my home that I spent and borrowed $1 million to buy, which was the median not that long ago, suddenly drops in value down to $500,000. It means that it won't go up 10% next year. It might go up 2%.
Yeah.
And we need to get back to that kind of state, because otherwise we're in this situation where we're just driving wealth and income inequality at these ridiculous rates of 10, 12, 15% in some cases, where the value of a home is increasing at a rate that's triple what wages grow at. That's one. That was one of the problems with the budget. What's your second one?
The reform of the stage 3 tax cuts.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I think it was excellent reform. You and I have spoken a number of times about the stage 3 tax cuts, and we were quite firm in our belief that Labor wouldn't touch them. They needed to, but probably weren't going to because of the timidity and everything else. So when they finally did it, I was greatly relieved. I do think they did it probably about 12 months too late, but at least they did it. I'll give them that.
They did it.
Apparently I'm in a mood where I'm not happy about anything and nothing's going to make me happy. I still think they are in probably some ways a little bit still too generous, but I think they balanced the financial and the politics fairly well.
Yeah, they're better.
But if you want to criticise the budget for being inflationary, and you're right, Leonie, I find this criticism of the budget being inflationary very odd because nobody's criticising the stage 3 tax cuts, which are part of the budget.
Which are presumably the main inflationary risk element of the budget, right?
Yeah.
Except that they're less inflationary than they would have been under the previous government.
Exactly.
Well, I love the argument that they're not inflationary because the people who are receiving most of the money don't need it and so won't spend it. Okay. And I've heard that justification on a number of occasions, both on the old structure of it and the new. But the idea that, well, because people who are earning $150,000, $190,000 a year don't actually need more money, so we can give them a tax cut and it won't be inflationary, seems like an odd rationale for me. It actually sounds exactly like you should hang on to that money and put it towards something else.
Yeah, I don't know, like social housing.
Like the people who are in poverty or social housing or one of those things. Let's put more money over there if the people we're giving it to over here don't actually need it. Call me socialist, but that's an odd one. That is an odd one for me.
Very strange. And especially, and I'm just coming back to the job seeker thing again because I can't believe how angry it makes me is so the Albanese government instituted a committee to actually look at this, and I can't remember. It's the EIA.
Inclusion Advisory Panel.
Thank you. Yes. And they came out and recommended that the government raise JobSeek to 90% of the pension. And Greg Jericho very handily provided graphs showing still actually still below the poverty line because the pension kind of sits around the poverty line. Albanese, he has so much political cover. Like there's so many independent, dryly economic advisory panels and committees, and the Business Council of Australia agrees that the job seeker is too low. How much political cover do you need to raise the bloody thing? Because apparently it's still not
If you're waiting
enough.
for Sky After Dark to advocate for it, you're in trouble.
Maybe that's what's it. The combination of this of the reformed stage 3 tax cuts, which I agree was good reform and should have been done, contrasting that against the whole, but we still can't afford to raise job seeker. It's just so unfair. And it's so not the kind of country.
What's the figure on that? What's the figure that they would have had to commit to if they increased it in line with the recommendation?
$12 billion a year. Yeah, about $12 billion a year.
Oh, 12 billion. Sorry.
Stage 3 tax cuts are $20 billion a year. We increased defence spending by $10 billion a year. We haven't even mentioned the $50 billion in extra funding for defence, because that's barely worth mentioning. But there were a number of things that cost the budget more than this would. But the thing that is worth noting is that the analysis suggests that if you increase the rate of job seeker and the student support payment and the rest of it, it actually improves the budget by more than 1-to-1. So you put $12 billion into the hands of those people, they spend it. So all of that money flows straight back into the hands of small businesses in your local communities, into pharmacies, doctors' services, physio and carer services, etc., etc. It goes straight back into the service economy, into food, into retail, etc. And it has a multiplier effect across the economy. So spending that same money in that way has a positive impact, and it actually gets the economy moving in areas where you kind of want it to be moving, because it drives demand in areas that are not going to drive inflation.
Yeah.
And I know that's not clear, but the main drivers of inflation at the moment are rents and electricity prices and fuel. These people aren't going to be driving up those prices with their spending on groceries, medication, and health services. And finally, being able to afford some clothes and that kind of stuff. That's not going to be the thing that drives inflation. Inflation is over here driven by structural issues that money doesn't touch. That same money that goes towards tax cuts, where a big chunk of it is going to medium and higher income earners, well, that doesn't flow back into the economy at all. It flows back into the economy at the rate of something like 17 cents in the dollar. Whereas over here, it actually has more than $1's impact, positive impact on the state of the economy, as well as really, really positively impacting hundreds of thousands of lives. It should be a real no-brainer. But as we've said before, government policy and the way in which our economy is structured requires that being unemployed be unpleasant, so that people who are employed won't get too uppity about their wage demands. It is a necessity of our economic structures and our neoliberal capitalist structures that being unemployed be awful. And if you go and pay those people even benefits near the poverty line, it no longer becomes so desperately awful that people who are working want to avoid it at all costs. I think that's pretty crap, to be honest.
It's a really amazing unspoken philosophy from the Labor Party.
Yeah, they are perpetuating it.
The capitalist, business positive, neoliberal, hunting poor people for sport people. You accept that, but it's literally on the tin. It's the Labor Party. They're supposed to be for the worker. And it is because they have done nothing about it, they are accepting and perpetuating the fact that they want workers to live in fear of an even worse fate, and that is to be unemployed.
The other thing it does for us, though, is it stops people taking risks, like starting up a new business, trying a new skill, pursuing an artistic or creative pursuit. So we are poorer culturally, we are poorer intellectually, and we are poorer economically by pursuing this strategy. It's not just that wages don't go up as much. We are literally poorer as a society right across the board by making people fearful for their livelihoods.
But that's also, it's assuming that the increase that was proposed somehow makes it easy, but it doesn't.
Oh, no.
It really doesn't.
It makes it easier.
Makes it easier without question, but it doesn't make it easy by any stretch of the imagination. And so,
no. These people aren't suddenly buying caviar.
No,
You know,
like they
no.
might be able to eat 3 meals.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so what we're talking about is still, if we put it in those really rough terms, right, which are really rough, but it is the reality that we want people to have an incentive to get a job, right? So structurally, it makes sense. We don't want there to be an incentive to not get a job. We want there to be an incentive to get a job, but we don't want a society where people cannot afford to be in a position to go and get that job. And that's what that is currently preventing. Like, it's keeping people well below the poverty line, where they are not able to go and get a job and get themselves out of that.
Let me rephrase that slightly, Leonie, because I don't think, I at least don't want us to be encouraging people to get a job. I want to encourage people to contribute to a healthy and thriving society. And that may not be a 9-to-5 job. That might be taking a chance on an artistic pursuit, writing a book, producing a work of art. It might be caring for someone who's ill. It might be caring for the environment or volunteering to plant trees or something. I want to encourage people to contribute, not necessarily to contribute economically only.
Yeah.
And I just want to be clear about that distinction, because I think it can get lost sometimes. So I'm not saying that's where you were going with it necessarily, but I just want to be explicit with that for our readers, because I know the Democrats as a party think about that notion of thriving and national prosperity in much more broad terms than economic.
So I love that, and absolutely, but the same point is true, right? In that
Sure.
they cannot do that if they're not able to eat 3 meals a day and
Absolutely.
have a roof over
No,
their
absolutely.
heads, right?
Absolutely.
So their
Absolutely.
contribution to the economy, in whatever form that takes, requires them to have a base level, and they're not anywhere close to that base level. But what I'm saying is, what was proposed by way of increase by the Advisory Council wasn't going to actually have
No, it
them
wasn't
in
lavish.
some flash sense. Yeah. The only thing I can think of as to what justification they have for not rising to that suggestion is this fear factor again, right? They're not having the courage and working within these 4 squares of, we don't want to be criticised for this budget, and we don't want anyone to say this budget has inflationary elements to it. And that would have been one that I get your explanation, Steve, and I think you're hopefully spot on in terms of it being different in terms of the impact it would have from an inflationary perspective, but they would be incapable of forming a narrative or responding to an alternative narrative around that, given what we've seen in their failing on that front on everything else.
Yeah, I mean, job seeker at the moment, it literally is serving as a barrier. The philosophy is that we don't want unemployment to be so comfortable that people are inspired not to work. We want it to be sufficiently uncomfortable that they are inspired to go and get a job. The problem is, it is now so uncomfortable, they're literally prevented from going and getting a job.
Yes.
Or contributing in some other way.
In some way, yeah.
Which has an ongoing or has an impact on our economy as well.
Like, it's no longer living up to the stated goal, right? It's so bad now. They're not even achieving the stated goal anymore. And it amazes me that they can't fix it.
The likelihood that someone would give up work in order to receive unemployment benefits is farcical. But equally, if you read the Reserve Bank's board meeting minutes, you'll see that they very much, as a matter of economic policy and monetary policy, want to maintain a cohort of 750,000, give or take, unemployed people. They want it as a matter of policy. So even if you did make it easier for people to look for work and to make the attempt to participate in the paid workforce, we don't want them all employed. And that bit's not even up for debate. It's literally stated every single time they put meeting minutes out. We've got an unemployment target that we're aiming for, and we're not there yet. So the floggings will need to continue until such time as enough people are unemployed. Like, that's our strategy. We're just going to keep at it.
And I think that's a really good point, Steve, because a couple of the interest rate rises we've had have been in response to unemployment falling below where the Reserve Bank would like it to be. And they've raised interest rates in order to get unemployment up.
Yes, as explicit goals, right? Like, as explicit goals. So this is one of these sort of ongoing contradictions in public policy that I can't reconcile. And I can only see it in terms of, it feels like punishment. But you have this group of people that you intentionally maintain as unemployed, and then you pay them a benefit that is destitution level in order so that other people look at it and go, well, I don't want that to be me, with the stated intention of taking the heat out of wages negotiations.
Madness.
Can I just throw something else in the mix here? Because this
Please.
is something that jumped out to me on Tuesday night, which was that there is an increase in spending in the aged care sector,
Yes.
which is fabulous, worth celebrating. Absolutely
Finally.
needs
Yep.
reform. But what we're talking about, and if I kind of use that link to the aged care pension and job seeker, right? But what the advisory council was suggesting was that the job seeker be increased to 90% of the aged pension, right?
Yep.
So only 90% of it, not 100% of it. So we are focusing on supporting those in the upper age brackets of our population, and this is going to sound really quite, I'm trying to find a way of diplomatically saying this, and I'm not sure whether I can, but it's playing to people who are more likely to be engaged in the political process and risking those who are in destitution because we're not paying them anything that enables them to live healthily and have 3 meals a day, and kind of going, I'm going to risk that we're not going to get their vote anyway. I hope that wasn't the rationale, but it feels like there's some politics in there, right? Where is our base voting going to come from? We have a whole lot of people in this bracket that are getting older and are looking to what's that going to look like, or are older and are not getting the support they need. If we funnel money into that, which is absolutely required, so I don't want to take away from that because that was worthy of celebration, but we're doing that, but where they're not actually addressing a really obvious critical need, and something that, again, the advisory council was saying, how about we just increase it, like a bit to just 90% of the age pension?
I think the political Tetris.
So I think
that
I've got your
described-
outrage now, Elana.
I know you looked very confused by it for a long time, and I kind of felt bad. But I think you
No,
there now.
I wasn't confused by it. It was more, I was probably being way too conciliatory in terms of just going, do you know what? It's a hard gig that they've got, and they're trying to balance all of these things, and they haven't done structural reform that would enable them to do more than what they've done. So, and I stand by that. But I also then go to, they're not being brave. Again, it comes back to they're not being brave. They're not doing things that would actually make a significant difference in areas. They're just kind of doing little sprinklings.
Yeah. And I think the political Tetris that you've just described is they're working on the assumption that the most vulnerable in society will not vote against their own interests and vote for those who want to hunt them for sport, and therefore will vote for Labor, either directly or indirectly, because even if they vote for the Greens or another minor party like the Democrats, their second and third preferences will flow to Labor anyway. And what they're trying to do by cuddling up to the older demographic who traditionally have voted more conservatively is to try and swing their votes back to them. And it comes back to the whole imperative to hold power. And probably the chief criticism of Labor is the whole, well, they need to be in governance in order to be able to implement changes. But in order to maintain government, they need to peel votes away from their competitors, which ends up in this catch-22 of, well, in order to secure those votes and remain in government, they can't actually do anything kind of big. And the Tetris becomes all around how do we stay in power as opposed to exercising that power and doing what it is that they probably enter politics to do, and which is make the country a better place.
During the election, when they put forward very small target strategy, people who were critical of the lack of broad ambition were told to be patient.
Yep.
That we're better off having them in power, and then we'll really see what they could do. Their first budget in October 2022, we were told it's their first budget. They can't fix everything in one go. You've got to be patient. In their second budget in 2023, we were told you can't fix everything. We can't afford everything, but at least we've got a surplus. Here we are again, and being told to be patient because they need a second term before they can really do good things. At some point, I think people have a right to be a little bit impatient and maybe to lose their patience, especially around things where it's having like a really negative and significant impact on somebody's quality of life. And when we think about our lack of action on the environment, when we think about our lack of action on inequality, when we think about the lack of significant action on housing, and there have been promises, but they're being slow to roll out, I think it's reasonable to start saying, okay, we really need to be seeing more, and we're really not seeing enough. And I worry that in the absence of a coherent vision and a coherent narrative around what we're trying to work towards, and a lack of a sense of urgency around some of these really critical challenges, people will wonder why they bothered.
Yeah. Which is not to say that they will then immediately go and vote for the coalition, because
No.
probably the only
No.
saving grace for the Labor Party is that the coalition has even less of a vision and a narrative and a clue than the Labor Party does. I mean, none of what the coalition is coming up with is attractive to anybody but the very narrow vested interests who would benefit from the nonsense that they're coming up with. So this narrative of the slightest criticism of Labor means that you're going to vote for the LNP is still nonsense. I think the things that Labor needs to be careful of is that the rise of the community independents in Liberal-held seats may not necessarily be restricted just to Liberal-held seats in 2025. Labor might find themselves under siege. And I think the rise of the community independents, it's the canary in the coal mine. It is the electorate telling both major parties that if you don't lift your game and start representing the interests of the nation as a whole, then we will replace you. We will find a new way to govern this country that serves the interest of the people of this country, because that is the primary purpose of the government, is to look after its citizens. And we've had decades of governments who have not done that and who are persisting in not doing that. I read somewhere, and I don't know if this is accurate or not because it was on Twitter, but somebody on Twitter said that the inequality gap in the United States, not Australia, but the United States, is now greater than it was between the peasantry and the aristocrats in France in 1789.
Yes. And it's worse than it was in America in the 1920s before the crash and the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Yeah, which was the next worst that it was in America.
Yeah. And that probably feeds into probably a series of podcasts we need to do about defence. And for those who are not history nerds like me, 1789 is when the French Revolution kicked off and they started chopping rich people's heads off.
Literally.
Yeah. So I wonder how great the gulf is in Australia and how far away we are from our 1789. Which is probably a discussion for another time. But sorry, one last gripe, because it appears to be, Elana's going to gripe about stuff today. I think it was the new chief political correspondent for the Saturday paper, in their discussion about the budget on the 7am podcast, just went, this is a really political document. You think? And she framed it in a way, and I'm sorry to criticize this one journalist because the rest of her discussion was actually very, very good and very interesting. But she framed it as if that was something new or unusual. And it's like, every budget's a political document.
It's the most political document you get, right?
Yeah.
It's the budget tells you what that government is deciding about what its vision for Australia is and how it's going to spend the money that we give it and how it's going to create whatever change it wants to create. Like it is fundamentally political in that sense. I mean, it's kind of a question of what politics is, right? But if we think about all of the things that we've talked about today, every decision that they make has fundamental political consequences for them and for us as the citizens, right? Every single one of them. It's
the manifesto tattooed on your back. I can't think of a more political document.
Yeah, so my little gripe to our listeners is, if a journalist tells you that this budget's really, really political, they're either incredibly naive or they're trying to bullshit you, because every budget for time immemorial has been highly political. Don't allow them to frame it as a criticism of the current regime, as if it's something new and unusual. The 2020 budget was highly political. The 2021 budget was highly political. The budget that Josh Frydenberg had down in the lead up to the 2022 election, super political. Let it go. So, which I will now take my own advice and let it go. So before we wrap up, because we are running out of time, any last minute observations, gripes, positives? Is there anything positive that we overlooked?
I want to just do one little thing that connects to your French Revolution moment. It's very easy to go, oh my God, the world, and how have we not taken up these opportunities? I actually think this is I go back to my meat pie analogy, right? There is a lot in this budget that was good. There's a lot in this budget that it was unknown, a little bit like a meat pie can be, but that was otherwise just bland and okay. And how lucky are we that we live in a country and within a political system where that is possible, and actually it's largely just kind of going along as it should. And your French Revolution moment, I think, Elana, I am very concerned about what that looks like in the US, right? Because all of the indicators of what's happening within their political system suggest that there is a whole lot pointing to that direction perhaps than we would like to acknowledge at the moment. And I want to celebrate what our system actually still somehow delivers, which might be bland, but maybe sometimes bland is really good. And that sounds like a really sad statement, but when we think about what else is going on in the world, in many parts of the world actually, but on that French Revolution connection bit, we're not there. Yes, we have a chasm that we need to address, and we need to address more systemically and bravely than we are at the moment. But I'll take my meat pie and be grateful that I've at least got that.
My sort of reflection on it would be that there are a lot of good elements in the budget. If the critique is that it hasn't gone far enough, I think that's better than criticisms that we've had of past budgets where we seem to be walking backwards or leaping backwards into the past. This at least feels progressive, but maybe not urgent enough in some of the areas where we feel like greater urgency is both necessary and warranted. So the Treasurer and the Labor Party would respond to that with, because we're being restrained and we're being responsible, and we're trying to approach this as a program rather than as a one-off, and I accept that. But there are a lot of good elements in there. So we've seen funding for some programs that really deserve it. We haven't seen enough funding for some programs that we think really need it. That suggests a degree of balance, but my main criticism of it will be that some of those really urgent issues, and I had the same critique last year, that some of those really urgent issues like inequality, like homelessness, like housing affordability, like domestic violence, don't seem to be getting a policy response that matches the urgency or the severity of the problem.
Yeah.
So that would be my encouragement to the government going forward, that they look to match the urgency that the electorate is looking for. And my other advice would be to try and work on their narrative structures over the next couple of months at least. They should have a much stronger story to tell. I think they have a much better story to tell than they have been telling. They really need to start telling it.
Yeah. I think it's an excellent wrap up, Steve. I think you've sort of nailed it. As much as I have been furious on this podcast, I didn't hate the budget. I just wished it was more. And that's probably why I'm furious, is that it had so much scope to be more, and they sort of fudged it. But as you said, overall, it's not a bad budget. It is restrained and balanced and responsible. That is still novel, to have a responsible budget that's not overtly serving people that don't really need to have their interests served. So I did consult the youth in the lead up to this. The Daily Oz is a sort of youth-oriented news service, which I think is actually really, really excellent and explains things to young people really, really well. Their favourite comment on their budget coverage was from one of their listeners who just went, "I'm whelmed. Not overwhelmed, but underwhelmed. Just whelmed." And I think that really sums it up. Leonie, thank you, though, for allowing me to drag you in at the last minute and for punishing you for admitting that you're a little bit of a budget nerd.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And so, as always, could not have done this deep dive budget analysis without your attention to detail.
My pleasure. I look forward to doing it again come budget season 2025. Thank you both.
Testing, testing, testing. So there was a point that I was working toward in that discussion, and in a chronic case of the I should have said, I didn't work it out until I was editing the podcast, which was not helpful. So the point So the point related to the question of Labor's bravery, both with this budget and with the way they have governed in this term. So the point related to the question of Labor's bravery, both with this budget and with the way that they have governed in this first term. And it finally clicked for me that there's a distinct difference between the way the coalition chooses to govern, particularly in the first term after being in opposition, and the way Labor is governing in this term. The coalition, when they take power, will unapologetically put their stamp on the country. As soon as they can, after they take power, they will unashamedly cancel, roll back, amend, or otherwise destroy every institution or initiative that the previous Labor administrations have introduced that they don't like, even if they supported the legislation in opposition. You would have seen it with the carbon price, the mining resources rent tax, the NBN, even the NDIS. Malcolm Fraser killed off what was then called Medibank, and Bob Hawke reintroduced it as Medicare. And the only reason Medicare has survived is that it has become such an integral part of Australian society that it's political suicide for the coalition to kill it off. But they do their best. You'll notice that every single coalition government will chip away at Medicare. They'll defund things. They will make it more and more difficult for Medicare to function. And that is 100% by design. So it's striking, but Labor doesn't seem to govern like that. In particular, this Labor government isn't governing like that. So terrible policy decisions like the cost of degrees and education that I referred to earlier in the pod remain in place today. And Labor just spackles over the top with admittedly excellent initiatives like paying students for their placements. But even the stage 3 tax cuts that Steve and I have discussed and railed against repeatedly, as regular listeners to the podcast will know, they didn't get rolled back. They got amended, and admittedly, they were greatly improved. But it took Labor until the 11th hour to do it. I mean, they come into effect on July 1st. This budget was their last roll of the dice on amending the stage 3 tax cuts. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm naive, but if I was given the enormous privilege of being in government, I wouldn't waste any time implementing my vision for the country. But that presupposes that I have one, which neither of the major parties seem to. So this episode is quite long enough, and I've taken up quite enough of your time. But I have links in the show notes to the podcast that I snipped those audio pieces from if you want to listen to them. And I've also linked to some other podcasts that pick up on some of the issues we discussed in this one, particularly Peter Dutton's shtick on immigration in his budget reply. That was very interesting. So if you've made it this far, thank you. I really appreciate it. Keep the Bastards Honest is brought to you by the Australian Democrats. This episode was edited and produced by me, Elana Mitchell. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Facebook, the platform formerly known as Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Spoutable, YouTube, and TikTok by searching for Australian Democrats. And you can see what we stand for, what we value, and what our policy positions are at our website at democrats.org.au. Email us at info@democrats.org.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.